My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we sail the wine-dark sea between the stars, guided by a planar compass.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. Planar Compass is a zine for old school essentials describing a fantasy setting where ships sail on a sea that connects different planes of existence. We are discussing issues 1 and 2.
Issue 1 is a 60-page zine written by D.M. Wilson and Sarah Brunt with art by Chris Downey. The first half of this issue describes Dreamhaven, an island in the interplanar sea that serves as a starting point for a campaign, with numerous NPCs and adventures involving various treasures, the dungeon beneath the island, and potentially the island's destruction. The second half has new classes for old school essentials and psionics rules, which we will not be covering because that is not what we do on this podcast. Now, issue 2 is 70 pages and is all about sailing the planar sea, with writing by D.M. Wilson, Sarah Brunt, and Goblin's Henchman, editing by Jared Sinclair, layout by Micah Anderson, and art by Chris Downey and Mike Lake. Now, this one contains rules for astral seafaring, utilising the Hexflower method created by Goblin's Henchman. See our previous episode about the zine Carapace for more about Hexflowers. And there are also monsters, particularly the Kier, eventually a Leviathan that hunts down ships, but it starts its life cycle using dead bodies as a host vehicle. And there are pirates, encounters, adventure hooks, various planes, magic items, and a Hexflower dungeon within the Kier Leviathan itself.
Let's talk about how we have used this in our gaming. I've only read them. Tom?
Yeah, I've run 5 sessions of this using OSE, Old School Essentials. Slightly more on Zine 1, to be honest with you, but got a decent amount of mileage out of the sailing, but I haven't tried all the monsters, I'll admit that, just a smattering of them.
So things we liked about Planar Compass. We both have the same opening disclaimer and caveat, so why don't we just go ahead and get that out of the way. So, listeners, I'll speak for myself here, but I think Tom shares some of my feelings. This is not normally my thing. It has a certain whimsical quality and especially in issue 1, almost like hijinks and antics that is not really what I go for in gaming so much. Having said that, I used to. I used to really love Spelljammer, and this is very, very Spelljammer influenced. And so I get the appeal. Just my personal tastes have kind of drifted to other things lately. But that's a caveat, though. There's a lot to like here. Tom, do you want to give your disclaimer as well?
Yeah, my disclaimer is much the same, except I didn't used to like Spelljammer. So, no, it's very much not my cup of tea in terms of the style of fantasy that it is. So if we seem to be not saying nice things about that part, that's probably why, right? It might be, if you like this kind of stuff, then probably you'll like it. I am into the sailing side of things, as we both are. So that appealed to me a lot more. And do you know what? It's really well put together. Let's segue immediately into some high-level good stuff,
yes,
right?
Let's do it.
Issue 1, I think, has a wonderful flow to it. It starts off with introducing the key NPCs and quest givers that you need to know to start with your little tavern starting point where you can book a room, and it leads you into its mini dungeon to start with, and onwards into that, and then sort of it lets you go from that funnel point into a quite sandboxy set of decisions after that as well, with several available different things to do and different places to do them. Yeah, I really liked it, and I've advocated in the past for building in little mini tutorial levels like video games do, and that's kind of what this does, which is good stuff. Yeah,
structurally I found that really interesting as well. My initial comments are even at a higher level as far as like what things I like about this. We had a week longer than anticipated to ruminate on this because we were originally going to schedule our recording. We scheduled our original recording for a week earlier than we did, listeners. And I've had an extra week to think on this a little bit. And even though this kind of whimsical fantasy is not really my thing, I do think that there's a certain power in the setup here. The way that you start in this jaunty spaceport setting, and then you kind of move out into this more like unknown, weird, even horror inflected space, I think is really great. The mini dungeon structure that Tom just talked about is a really interesting introduction to the tone that I think this is going for. I've come to appreciate issue 1's tone a little bit more as a sort of setup for what comes later. And I think we'll talk about this more in the expert delve, but that's just my initial high-level thought. Other high-level things, I mean, I want to just get production values out of the way because I think they're pretty good here.
Oh, yeah. Do you have the print copy as well?
I only have the PDF.
Because I did get that, and really nice.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. That's good to know. I think the artwork is pretty good. It's very plentiful. I like about 85% of it, and that's a good number considering there's so much.
Yeah.
So you're getting like a lot of good artwork. I do wish a little bit more of it was in color because I actually like the color pieces the most. I'm not normally a person who thinks that artwork should have to be in color, but the color pieces are really striking in these two. I suppose that's what Kickstarter or whatever is for.
Well, yeah, that's right. And I'm thinking of one in particular, that picture in issue 1 of the giant striding through the sea. That's really good. If it was all like that in issue 1 in particular, it would be great.
I think issue 2 is maybe it's even a little more visually interesting than issue 1. Yeah. It doesn't have as much artwork, or like illustrations at least, but it has really nice strong use of reds and golds. The headers are interesting. I think issue 2 as compared to issue 1 has a more clear, there's a more clear visual stylistic goal than issue 1.
It's definitely stepped up a level from the first one, without wanting to criticize the first issue too much. But yeah, and also actually the use of color that you mentioned is done very effectively on the hex flowers, because you actually have to flip between those a bit, and so it's good to be able to identify which one you're looking for, and it does that by just hooking into the the lizard brain that connects yellow with good things and darkness with scary space and in between exactly. All that.
Yeah. Okay, let's get back to more substantive things. Keep going, Tom. What do you like about this?
Let's stick with some of the issue 1 things that I like. There is a mysterious oracle in a tower who gives out these predictions. And the best thing about them is, firstly, no one's ever seen this oracle. The oracle dispenses prophecies by seemingly basically writing a little village newsletter that it leaves in a box at the base of the tower, and people go and read it. And you can show the pictures that the oracle has drawn to the players, and they will go, oh, that seems menacing. Yeah. I will tell you, those predictions are 100% accurate, and no one will do anything about them or pick up what they mean until it's too late. But then they'll look at them afterwards and go, oh, yeah. So that's perfect. What else? We're going to do a spoiler here. So issue 1, the main thing that you will notice probably about the cover is that the island on it is shaped like a big hand. Right. 1 or 2 of your players may even go, look, it looks like a hand. That's funny. And there's one particular thing that they are quite likely to do. One group that did it, the other didn't when I ran this, which causes the island to start turning back into the giant hand that it actually is. And then the giant one-handed owner shows up looking for it, and the whole thing falls into the sea, basically, which is pretty good, I think. Just having this it's silly, but it's also terrifying when this titanic being hoves into view. I think that's nice. And I mentioned it earlier as well, the sandboxiness. There are multiple options for getting off the island and for getting into the dungeons and all that. It's not been put together as a trail of clues, with one exception that I'll complain about in the next section. You could be going under the island for 2 or 3 reasons simultaneously. Or you go down, you might get the treasure, and then decide afterwards who you're going to give things to, or whether you're going to deny them what they want, which is really nice. So, do you want to talk about Hedge-Mazia, or am I?
Well, here's the thing. I'm going back to maybe another more higher level idea, I guess, but I think in issue 1, there is an unmistakable sense of joy in the writing. Okay. I would say it's infectious in both negative and positive connotations of that word. The author's clearly having fun. Yeah. You've got there's a section called Pantry Raid. I mean, come on. I mean, I have said the word Hedge-Mazia in my head enough to convince myself that it's a good name.
Do you know why I've realized I actually am quite into that name Hedge-Mazia? It's because even if you gave this little pocket dimension of hedge mazes a different name, like a quote unquote proper name, the players would call it Hedge-Mazia. That's the name it would acquire, isn't it?
That's the sensibility that I think is here. When I think Hedge-Mazia, I think of the Gardens of Yin or something. That's the version I want to do. But you're right. there's a joy and a frivolity to it, which I think is undeniable. It is maybe not my thing, but I definitely get why people would like it. Issue 2 is definitely more to my taste in terms of tone and content, though.
Yeah.
It just has more of those horrific elements that were in the Spelljammer setting. The thing about Spelljammer, which I think Planar Compass does a good job of nailing, is that Spelljammer was also equal measures of silly and scary. Spelljammer had the hamster gnomes and like the hippo people and all that.
My one time playing Spelljammer, I was forced to fight a hippo person, so that's the thing I remember about it.
Right, like it had all those things, but it also had Nyogi. It had like ships full of mind flayers. It had these like really scary alien races, the hive mind beholders, all that stuff. And there's also just there's a basic horror element at work when you just sort of land your ship on a rock floating out in the middle of space, or monsters are just appearing out of the cosmic void at your ship. That has a certain like power to it. I think that Planar Compass does a good job of capturing both of those tones pretty well. And so I think that's to its credit because that's clearly what they were trying to do. I had not had a chance to really appreciate some of the structural elements you've talked about because I haven't run it or played it. But now that you've spoken on them, I can definitely see it.
Shall we talk about issue 2 a bit, I guess?
Yeah, well, so I guess the last thing I'll say is I like the monsters in issue 2. I think the bestiary is really cool in issue 2. There's some good stuff in there.
That was one of my regrets only doing like a total of 5 sessions between 2 groups. Is I kind of wanted to use everything that was in there, and there is not enough time to do that. I'll call out for one the lobnaut, the claws and eyes of a lobster, the jaws of a shark, and I think the tail of a serpent and the flippers of a tortoise.
I feel like I watched a movie on Sci-Fi Channel that was that, but
I think I may have. Yeah, that seems familiar, doesn't it? It's good. The Kier, which is they've combined the Leviathan, zombies and the classic alien from the film of the same name into one thing, like the different stages of the life cycle, which is pretty good getting that in. Well, number 2, the main thing in that issue is ships. So it's got nice pictures of ships you can sail around in. It's got the rules for sailing them. I won't go too much into how hex flowers work now. Just Google hex flowers, you'll find it. But it's a good execution of it because it's using different random rolls for different parts of your voyaging and then kind of parceling those things out amongst the players in the group to do. So one person does the weather, one person does the navigation, one person does what's the weird interplanar effects we're having. And that's something actually that Goblin's Henchman, I recall, mentioned in Carapace, but I don't think had really codified or built into the presentation of the hex flower system. Whereas here, it's all broken out into loads of hex flowers over different pages, and it works well. Although I have a couple of caveats here, which I'm going to stick in here because this is still a good thing. It's not a question section, but I messed up a bit with one of the groups, the first group, where I didn't spend enough time introing it. It's vital for the mechanics to be understood by the group. If you just say, okay, we're going sailing now, you roll 2d6, you roll 2d. They can't engage with it. It's not fun or interesting. Then it's just like random rolls and you're just reading out some numbers. When you know what those rolls mean, then it's more fun. It's, I'm doing the encounter table roll, or I get to... that's good.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's definitely worth doing. Just spend a little time saying what the mechanics mean, even if normally you prefer to maybe make that a little more opaque. It's enough fun to justify that behind the curtain thing. And another thing to mention is that the rolls are almost entirely random. There's not, apart from some of the stuff in the special classes in issue 1, as written, there's not much that the players or their characters' skills can do to affect them. So that's just something to make everyone aware of as well. Don't let them agonize over who's the best at seeing things and therefore should do the lookout post, or who's the best at steering ships, right? Because it's irrelevant. It's just a random roll.
Right, yeah.
And you'll be there for like 10 minutes going, yeah, okay, this is a great chat, everyone. Can we just get on with it and get attacked by a shark lobster? Which is what you want to get into.
Yeah, let's move on to questions we had. Okay, here's the thing. I played Spelljammer back in the day. I enjoyed Spelljammer back in the day. And part of what made Spelljammer so exciting back then is that it presented monsters that were very dangerous by themselves on land as these large groups. Like I put them on big ships where there are like hundreds of them. Back then, it was a very like holy shit moment when you first read about a Titanic hive mind beholder ship. Your mind is being flooded with like all the implications of that because you know what beholders are and you know how beholders operate in the setting. And I think that was probably really, really important to Spelljammer. It is also probably Spelljammer's downfall, if I'm being honest, because it is frequently criticized for its gonzo-ness, right? And it's a little how over the top it is. I do wonder how important is that to a Spelljammer-like setting? This setting clearly has its analogs, like the Kier, for example, being kind of a mashup of kind of like mind flayers and the sort of hive mind creatures and all these other things, right? It's clearly meant to be the big bad, like, space species. It has its analogs, but it doesn't have mind flayers and beholders, right? Like how important do we suppose that is to a Spelljammer-like setting?
It's really hard for me to say, as I've mentioned, I've only fought one hippo person in Spelljammer, but I think I can see that, oh no, there's a whole ship of them thing in this, because there is a progression from issue 1. There's a bit where you basically go on a fishing trip and get attacked by... Is it by the Kier or is it just by some skeletons? I forget. But
I don't recall.
It's something similar. It's like, it's that idea of, we nearly got murdered by 4 of these things last week. Now we've got a whole ship full of them. That feels like a problem. So it does have that escalation.
Even if it doesn't have that, listeners, that might be a good thing to throw in. Put in a lone Kier.
Yes.
In issue 1.
Because, and I wonder if that's why it has the Leviathan form as well that hunts you down, because Planar Compass cannot have the built-in menace that a ship full of mind flayers would have after years of AD&D. Right, everyone knows how bad mind flayers are,
right?
Even if they've never encountered them in game because they've read Dragon magazine,
right?
Whereas the Kier are just in Planar Compass. But knowing that the Kier Leviathan is the little counter on the Hex Flower that chases you around and is big enough to worry about, maybe that is substituting for that. If you know what I mean? I suppose the real solution is just to in your own game put mind flayers and beholders in without worrying about copyright, because it's your game.
Right, there's that part of it too, right? Yeah. All good points. I should mention that, listeners, we were originally recording this on the day that WotC announced 5e Spelljammer, and that was a total coincidence. That was like this is not something we did intentionally.
No. We're simply not that organized.
We are definitely not. Okay, what are your questions?
You mentioned hijinks earlier. There is a second segment of issue 1 that seems to me to follow a slightly trad. This scene happens, then this scene happens, this scene happens. I found in both my groups they didn't really react to the situations the way the text kind of expected them to. And it's to do with like kind of, is it the little kids from the Raccoon People ship are playing with a young Sphinx?
The little Sphinx thing,
stealing food from the tavern and so on. It felt like it sat awkwardly as well, with like everything else has been so sandboxy and freeform, and now you've got this trail of scenes. What was your reaction to that?
When I read that, I was more thinking about its place in things tonally, which was not for me. But I see the point of it in the sense that sometimes as a GM, you just need an activity for the players to do. Freeform sandbox is great, and I love like just roaming around and seeing what the characters get up to and exploring the setting. That's all very, very fun. But sometimes you do need like a thing, some kind of action, like something for them to get involved in.
Yeah.
Even if this never came up, I think it definitely like expresses the author's point of view about what they think the feeling of this module should be.
That's a good point.
This setting.
Yeah.
So it does do that to the extent that it's sort of teaching you the setting. I guess it's effective in that way. I can see your issues with it in play, but I kind of like the idea of like, even if it just ends up being like a background thing.
Yeah, to be fair, there's probably a bunch of people tuning into modules of the sort that we generally like going, where's the starting scene? What happens next? This is rubbish. So maybe it's a good idea to cater to more than one kind of people. My second question bit, which to be honest, I think you've kind of answered in that it's an important part of the two sides of a Spelljammer-y setting is I did find the more macabre parts. For example, there's a body snatching plot in issue 1 to be a little bit of a landmine when it started off as a game about raccoon people, clanky robots that that are bureaucrats. Maybe that's just a warning thing, which is like, if you are playing this with a child of 9 years old or less, maybe think of a different smuggling plot before you get to the bit where bodies are being dragged around. And actually, in practice, it was as simple as that.
I think it's probably going to come up in the expert delve.
It is a bit.
Yeah, let's just put a pin in that for the expert delve. And go to the chain lightning round. Tom.
The Kier pupa is built upon the corpse of a humanoid victim. Where the flesh should be, iridescent rainbow tendrils wrap around the skeleton to make it walk and attack. The tendrils lead up to the head, where the Kier larva resides, in place of the original lower jaw.
I mentioned that I love the monsters in issue 2. They have a really wonderful cosmic quality. I especially like a dragon, the Astral Amphitheater. It is, quote, semi-translucent with deep blue and purple coloration and sparkling points of starlight.
In the section introducing the different species that can be found around the Planar Sea, we have this, and I quote, about humans. They just seem to make their way everywhere. Even the astral plane is riddled with them.
There is a 2-page comic book panel spread in issue 2. Love that. Why don't more games do this? What a great way of showing what your game is supposed to be like.
Yeah, big in Japan, I understand. I would like to read this about psionic milk from issue 2. Psychic dugong milk restores at 1d20 psionic energy per round when consumed. Nutritious.
Of a character, Captain Hector. If some people are hammers and only see nails, Hector's a match and only sees kindling. Let's go to the expert delve. Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that new issues of Codex are now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Codex is the Gauntlet's bi-monthly role-playing game magazine. Each issue is organized around a theme and stuffed with brand new material for your table, including original games and supplemental material for games like Trophy and Brindlewood Bay. Check out Codex by going to patreon.com/gauntlet. Your pledge not only gets you Codex and other Gauntlet publications, but it also supports all the important work we do in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. If you'd like to try before you buy, there's always a free issue of Codex available on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you're looking for back issues, you can find them on DriveThruRPG, including in reduced price bundles. Thanks. It's the Expert Delve. Today's topic is whimsical fantasy, the most painful topic Tom and I have ever done. I'm not sure we qualify as experts, but we shall do our best.
No, mate. This might be just one of our ill-informed chat expert delves. Yes. Oh, hey, I've just come up with a great new name for this segment. No. All right, so I think we've got two principal questions. First, why would you play a game in a genre you don't particularly like?
There's that.
Yeah. Which I think we can dispose of fairly quickly. And secondly, why whimsical fantasy in particular? Like, does it have good points, and why might we want to choose it?
Should we define it somewhat? Like, what do we mean when we say whimsical fantasy? I have an idea, but it's like porn. You know, when you see it, kind of definition.
Yeah, I think it is. I think. Well, let's define a bit. Let's just do question 1 first, because I think it applies to all genres before we talk about whimsical fantasy. And that is, all right. If you're only like a 5 or 6 out of 10 interest level in a kind of game, why would you do it? And the answer is basically sometimes things aren't about you, or not only about you, right? So
right, yeah.
If your friends want to try something and it's not your absolute favorite, if it's not a total deal breaker for you to do it as well, give it a go. And for open table games, which is a thing I do on a actually not quite weekly basis, because sometimes I have to do stuff with my family. But I think approachability and a sense of safety, which we'll get more into, is important. Generally, you want to have at least one game on your slate or on a regular basis that seems easy to deal with, right? And even if it's just a matter as well, actually, similar to the first part of my answer, you might not like it, but someone out there does. And if you want them to come and try out your group, you should probably offer them do a horror game, do a fantasy game, do a mech warrior type game every so often, and see who goes for it. Yeah, I mean, what do you think about that? Yeah,
that resonates. I mean, I get it. As someone who literally built their role playing game career on open game tables, you've got people showing up. You want them to try out this hobby. You know, I would frequently have people who never tried a role playing game, right? Like they're just like getting into it for the first time at the Gauntlet, and it's always nice to have that mix. I used to run a lot of Dungeon World, and even though Dungeon World, even after my own tastes kind of moved on from Dungeon World, I still ran a lot of Dungeon World because Dungeon World has that slightly like higher fantasy, more adventurous tone, and it's a little bit more accessible for people. And indeed, if I knew I had a table of people who were like brand new to either the Gauntlet or brand new to gaming or whatever, I would usually do like a more, a lighter, like kind of rompier adventure.
Yeah.
Just to kind of like ease them into like our play culture, our play style. And so that makes sense. You still have like, Monster Hearts or whatever on the schedule, right? But it is good to have that. So that makes sense why you might want to do something a little more whimsical. Obviously, 5e has massive popular appeal.
Yeah, right? And frankly, part of my definition of whimsical fantasy does lean on 5e as a thing. I think there's a huge segment of that which is just Well, it's not gritty, is it? Let's put it that way.
I have never played 5e. My opinion of it is derived entirely from people I see talking about it on the internet, and it feels to me like a jaunty, whimsical thing. And it's not my thing, but I get the appeal, right? Like, it's undeniably popular. I have so far resisted the temptation to promote my Kickstarter, but I will tell you, like, and I'm breaking that temptation right now.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, my game, Brindlewood Bay, that is one of the biggest like points of feedback we get on it, is that people who don't normally play RPGs were interested in this because it is a lighter setting, right? Or at least initially. Mm. And so that's a good reason to do it. Yeah, because it's not always about you.
Yeah.
It's not always a sort of macabre body horror, cannibal fueled nightmare orgy, Jason. Like, not everyone's always into that, right?
No. So actually, well, I'm going to come back to this point after we've spoken about whimsical fantasy a bit as well. But actually, I've found that quite often people who are into that kind of thing will still wait for the more approachable game to come and try out a group.
Right. Yeah.
And then afterwards they'll be like, do you know what I really like is the novels of Clive Barker, so I'd love to play something like that. And then, that's true. That's fun too, right? Okay, so let's try and define our whimsical fantasy thing. What we think Planar Compass mostly is?
Mostly, well, in issue 1.
Right? In issue 1 it is, yeah.
I haven't looked. Is there an issue 3? I haven't looked at issue 3 yet.
I think there's an issue 3 coming, yeah. Or
yeah.
Kickstarter or something. But actually, I think it's actually a good point that contrast is an important part in a lot of whimsical fantasy things.
Yeah.
But I would say that what you're looking at mostly is friendliness. Some or all of these ideas of a pastoral setting that's quite gentle, fairly low stakes. I mean, what are the adventures in issue 1? It's like find out who's been stealing the food from the pantry.
Yeah.
Find a ring. It's not. It doesn't seem high stakes until a giant shows up.
Yeah.
Things that are not too frightening, or rather, like you can turn the frighteningness on and off in your head. Like you can carefully imagine a skeleton coming after you, or you can just be like, oh, it's just it's just a cartoon. Yeah, like you said, a lot of the 5e D&D aesthetic, frankly, I think is in this whimsical fantasy thing. It's all about larks and nearly getting very badly injured and then being helped up by your friends and going, phew, that was close. This
right,
kind of,
exactly right. Yeah.
A lot of the kind of character-based humor, like not with gags, but like sort of, I knew your PC would say something stupid to that town guard on the way in. That kind of thing. And drama, but only in very melodramatic terms. Right. Nothing that's too emotionally vulnerable, I would say. I think that's fair. Cute animal people, quirky inventions.
All that is bleh to me.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not camp, but it is distanced, right?
That's okay. So here's the thing, though, right? All that stuff you described is not how I like the game. However, having said that, I do think one of the powers of this sort of like whimsical approach is that, okay, so think about horror movies. I'm a big fan of horror movies, but I'm not a big fan of all horror movies. I don't like horror movies that are relentlessly bleak, right? So I am not a fan of the early aughts torture porn horror movies. That is not for me. It's pure bleakness, and I'm not into it. I like horror movies that have a certain camp aesthetic, or have humor, or have a setup for the horror, right? I think it makes the horror go down a little easier. I think it makes it more enjoyable. It can even make it scarier, depending on how it's framed. And so I feel like there is a similar thing that can be going on here. And I actually think that Planar Compass does a pretty good job with this. Whether intentional or not, I can't tell if it was intentional based off just the 2 issues, but it feels almost like Shot Chaser, but the chaser is first. You sort of like have this like fun, jaunty hijinks kind of thing, but then they finally get on the ship and they go out into space. And they encounter these fucking like awe-inspiring things, these horrific things. They start to like really take in like the bigness of the setting and the scariness of the setting. And I think that is a combination that works really, really well. Now, I'm going to go back to Brindlewood Bay for just 1 minute. I have a real thing to say here. This is not promotion. Okay. The thing about Brindlewood Bay, my game about elderly women who solve murder mysteries, and it has a cosmic horror element as well, currently on Kickstarter.
Absolutely incorrigible. Go on.
I know. The thing about Brindlewood Bay is there's an intentional part of the design where I intend for the players to have this like warm, cozy, frequently funny experience, right? It's meant to be kind of like Murder, She Wrote. It's meant to be Rosemary and Thyme. It's meant to be like Midsummer Murders. It's meant to have that feeling. But then that is just the setup for like the scary parts, right? For the horror parts. And I think in play, it's really, really powerful, especially over the course of a campaign. And so I think that this is something you can do with a more whimsical setup. And I think that's what they're trying to do in Planar Compass.
Yeah, I believe it is. And what I've observed in play of both Planar Compass and Brindlewood Bay is that players, and even the GM, to be honest with you, kind of choose their comfort level. So that extreme contrast between scary or awe-inspiring and cozy is available. Like you can go full on, oh no, this is terrifying, what's going to happen to Madge? She's going to be stabbed with a knitting needle behind the fish warehouse. But sometimes you look around the table and players, especially whoever's character it is really in the full experiencing horror mode. Other times, though, they're sort of doing it like, oh no, this is terrible, but in kind of a laughing way.
Right,
and you kind of get to pick. And it reminds me of, for example, what I would say is that a whimsical appearing, but not actually whimsical comic, which is Usagi Yojimbo, the samurai comic about a rabbit. And the thing with all of those is, they're anthropomorphic animals. When they die in a ninja battle, little skull speech bubbles come out of their heads to tell you that they're dead. And it's all cute, but then every so often you think about what's happening in this story and you become overwhelmed by powerful emotions. Yeah, it gives you that opportunity to kind of ratchet your closeness and vulnerability to these quite heavy things up and down, which is good. That's
one of the strengths of Usagi Yojimbo. I also am thinking of the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics, right? It has a similar kind of vibe where the setup is kind of fundamentally silly, but it kind of has this serious issues that it deals with, It kind of has this like very real emotion to it and this like quite dark tone. And I think that's a magical combination. I love it. I think that can be a very, very effective style of play and an effective weaving in and out of tones that can be very, very good at the table, especially in the medium of role-playing games.
Yeah.
Part of the tricky things about delivering any kind of genre in a tabletop role-playing game is you don't have the ability to do the conventions of the genre that exist in other mediums. For horror, we don't have splatter special effects. We don't have sound effects. In mysteries, we don't have like a forced perspective in like in a novel. You need things that invite the players into the experience, essentially. And whimsy can be one of those things.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I would say, though, to close out the genre part of the chat is I do think it's worth spending some time getting at least a bit invested in getting some meaningful stakes set for whimsical fantasy. All the things that we complain about, or people complain about with the 5e aesthetic, that it's too fluffy and light, is because nothing really matters.
And indeed, it's almost an affront to like put the characters in danger.
Yeah. It's safe to do that, but it's unsatisfying. And I think you can take a measured approach to it, of course, but making it clear, doing the old telegraphing the stakes, letting someone roll the dice, saying things like, you can jump off the roof from here, it's going to do you d6 damage, you've got 4 hit points, what do you want to do? That's a meaningful decision to make about your character's fate. And that's the point, especially for example, someone who hasn't done role-playing games before. That's the bit they're going to remember and think about, and that's the point where they kind of decide whether they like this hobby or not, really. It's
right, exactly.
When you get that.
That's true.
Yeah, so I guess I'm suggesting that you should force sudden decisions on people. No, it's meaningful stakes are worth building up, and it can be easy to miss that in between all the fun of meeting the tortoise guy that runs the apothecary's stall and so on. So don't lose sight of that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, super interesting topic. We're doing a good job of talking ourselves into whimsical fantasy.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Kind of. And I would like to make one last play for it, actually, if you'll indulge me, which is, as talked a bit about earlier, I do think it's a good idea if you're running an open table kind of game, and not even necessarily the Gauntlet style where you post a game and people sign up for it, but rather where you just say, every week, we're running some games. Come and join us if you want to.
Right, yeah.
The thing is that everything that you do in that setup, especially like for face-to-face physical games, that makes it a bit more of a hassle or a bit more daunting or a bit more difficult is where you lose people who otherwise are going to try out your group or try out RPGs. Are they sure they're going to be able to understand the language that you're using? So if you've got a bilingual group, like we in theory do, then stick 2 languages in your event description. Things like if they can't see into the venue from the street, that's a bit, you're going to open a door that you can't see literally can't see what you're walking into and just walk in and go, hey, I'm here for the game. That's like a really minor thing. And I think, but that could be the point where someone goes, do you know what? I'm not going to do it if they're feeling a bit shy. Yeah. And so That's one reason that these whimsical fantasy games are, as you mentioned, they're accessible. You feel like you understand what it's going to be. When you can promise that, that's when people show up, even if they're actually kind of into more hardcore genres. You know what I mean? More, more vulnerable, like things where you have to be a bit more basically vulnerable with the people at the table.
Listeners, please don't write in because of Tom's use of the word hardcore gamers.
Yeah, you might really be into splatterpunk, body horror stuff, but you might not necessarily want to do that with someone you never met before.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
And the thing is that the promise that you make with your event listing or whatever, you have to keep when they get there.
Yeah.
So even though a bit of a reversal or the contrast can be good, you've got to watch out for doing it too much, because your audition is not over when they sit down at the table. They've also got to leave the table thinking that was fine, I'll probably come back.
Right, yeah.
Not like I feel a bit manipulated or like I had the rug pulled out from under me. So like if you are going to put the scary Kia in your Planar Compass game, for example, you should mention, there might be scary skeletons and things in the description, which people can then choose whether they're going to show up for or not. But if you just put the stuff about raccoon people and robots and sailing the stars, that's probably what most of your games should be about. And just don't blindside people, basically. You've really got to keep your promises.
We've talked about this before. Yeah. There's a lot of power in setting expectations, whether that be in an event description, like you're describing for an open table gaming thing, whether that be just in the moment, sitting down with your group and like setting expectations using some kind of particular technique. I prefer cats. I think that probably like 75% of bad RPG experiences flow directly from the fact that the person running the game did not properly set expectations beforehand. Even a game that is clunky and maybe the GM doesn't really know what they're doing or they're just kind of wonky, people will still have fun as long as you're not blindsiding them. And so, setting expectations is really, really good. Definitely. So, anything else about whimsical fantasy? Which really the topic turned into onboarding new gamers.
Yeah, because that's my main thing, I think, is whimsical fantasy is how you onboard new gamers. That's my thesis statement.
That is the one value of it.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I'm sure there are more. Please write in and tell us what
we
the
found
other
the
values
thing
of
we
it.
liked.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, let's go to the next segment. Okay, it's companion adventures. You have quite a few more than me, so why don't you start, Tom?
Oh, okay. First thing is a book, The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Graham. If you want whimsical inspiration, this is as whimsical as it gets. There is a chapter in it that's really weird and doesn't fit with the rest of the novel called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, where I think, is it a baby otter goes missing, and then when they find him, he's sleeping at the feet of the forest god Pan, who is just playing a lullaby to him, and then they pick him up and they row away. Very weird. But yeah, I mean, there's a reason nobody remembers that chapter, because but there's that, and actually there's also Wild Wood by Jan Needle, which is the same story, you know, Toad of Toad Hall and all that lot, but told from the perspective of the ferrets and weasels and stoats. And they have a different perspective on events. So actually, if you want to do the compare and contrast part of whimsical fantasy, that's a good thing to read. Quite a fun read, as I recall, although it was a long time ago, and I might be wrong about that.
That actually gives me a pretty good on-the-fly companion adventure. Here we go.
Yeah.
I would say, from a gaming standpoint, Mouse Guard, it feels like a good recommendation.
Yeah, definitely.
Because Mouse Guard is interesting. I think it's one of those rare properties, meaning intellectual properties, I guess, that does this thing that we've talked about a little bit in the Expert Delve, like intentionally as a setting. It has this, like, on the surface of it, this kind of like lighter approach, right? It's about little mice rangers.
Yeah, and it's all like, their wagon's fallen over and the grain's on
that's the first
you know,
thing, right? Like the little missing grain peddler. It has that like low stakes quality in the beginning. It has that lightness, just the fact that it's like cute little animals. But it kind of transitions into being something much more serious.
Yeah.
One of our themes today has been easing people into different styles of play. Mouse Guard is interesting in that way. I will say that Mouse Guard is actually not my favorite system.
No, there's Mouse Ritter, which is considerably lighter.
I was going to say Mouse Ritter might be a good choice. There's also, it's probably maybe not super easy to find, but there's actually like a Powered by the Apocalypse version of Mouse Guard out there with the serial numbers filed off. It's very good and easy. It has all the same flavor, but it's an easier system. Mouse Guard as a system is actually really quite hard. I'm always perplexed by the people who recommend it as like a game for kids. Like, they're just looking at the mice. They're not looking at like the system, right? Like the system is really, really hard.
Yeah, the comics though, I think, are a great model.
The comics are great. Exactly.
Even if you don't go near the games, you just read the comics. Yeah,
absolutely. Let's do music. So in issue 2 of Planar Compass, there's a Donovan reference, which I love because how often do we get Donovan? Yeah, how often do we get like something about Donovan in a role-playing game product? So that was really great. That actually got me listening to Donovan, and I actually started to build a case in my head that Donovan feels very like musically relevant here, because I can imagine almost like Guardians of the Galaxy style. I can imagine like the characters roaming around Dreamhaven with like Donovan, like playing in the background, right? Like imagine like Season of the Witch playing in the background of characters walking around in this like place with weird, with weirdos, that could be fun. Or There Is a Mountain, which is the specific song that the issue references, would be a great like working on the deck of the ship song, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly perfect.
Yeah, that would work. I could see that. There is actually an official Planar Compass album you can find on Bandcamp, as it turns out. So it's quite synth-heavy, instrumental, chill-out prog. So, yeah, I mean, it's designed specifically to be background music for Planar Compass. So quite good for that, I found.
Yeah, I didn't know
because
that.
It's meant to be... I don't think you're meant to sit there and listen to it, at least not without smoking something first. But so it's incidental music, I would say, rather than a kind of... don't listen to it while jogging. You won't get anything done.
Yeah. I have a film. I think the 2002 animated film Treasure Planet is a pretty easy recommendation here. Not much loved at the time. In fact, it was quite despised at the time. But on a rewatch, it's actually pretty good. I don't even like cartoons, but I actually kind of enjoyed it when I watched it recently. A fun fact I discovered while looking up the release date of Treasure Planet: it's not even the first science fiction adaptation of Treasure Island. There is a 1982 film called The Treasure Planet, and there's a 1987 Italian film with the amazingly straightforward title Treasure Island in Outer Space.
See, that's the power of a public domain novel, isn't it? You can just do whatever you want.
I'm hoping in Italian it sounds more artistic or something. I don't know.
I mean, I watch a lot of spaghetti westerns, and I tend to find the English titles will normally be something like this, but then in Italian they'll sort of in a way be even worse, because they'll be called something like "Watch your head, my friend," with an exclamation mark in it. So yeah, maybe not. My last one, I'm gonna a bit of self-promotion in a way. I'm going to recommend a panel discussion that I and 3 of my cohorts from our regular One Shot Saturday group did for Gen Con Online last year.
Oh,
it's
that's right. Yeah.
How to host a drop-in RPG meetup.
Yeah.
And especially for, all the stuff we've been talking about, getting people to feel comfortable and like they can show up. And there's also some chat about what to do when you don't have enough people or you have too many people, all that kind of thing. So yeah, check it out. We'll stick the link in the fabled show notes, maybe. And there they'll be.
Fantastic. Listeners, that's our program. Fear of Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. The Gauntlet can be found on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. And you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you to our astral editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners, as ever, for listening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.